Last week we spoke about God's love for a sinning world. And we used John, the 3rd chapter, verse 16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever shall believe in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. And you may be, impressed would be the wrong word, Ernie, amazed that I was able to spend the entire lesson on what John said was able to write in probably 30 seconds, right? If that. But we're going to see if we can't take Ernie from amazed to impressed as we spend the second week all in the same verse. Because we talked about the love that God had for a sinning world. And we referenced as we looked at that verse that a very small word in this verse has great implications. For we read that John wrote, for God so loved, and by the way, Jesus said these words, so loved the world. He's talking about a particular kind of love, which is interesting because our love manifests itself in all kinds of different ways, and we have different kinds of love. But the love that God had for the world is a particular love with particular characteristics. In fact, we see many of them right there in that same verse, and we see many more, of which many I'm not going to be able to get to in my lesson. I've probably not discovered many of the characteristics of God's love yet. But we're going to look at 9 characteristics of that particular love of God. What does God's love look like? What does it act like? Mention John 3:16. But if you would as well turn your Bibles to 1 John, the 2nd chapter. And really the primary verse we're going to look at here is in chapter 3. But starting back in verse 28 of chapter 2, we read, and now little children, abide in him, so that when he appears we may have confidence and not shrink from him in shame at his coming. If you know, that he is righteous, you may be sure that everyone who practices righteousness has been born of him. And in chapter 3, verse 1, see what kind of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called children of God. And so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know him. There's a lot said in that short passage, but I want to focus on the first phrase of chapter 3. See what kind of love the Father has given to us. The kind of love that has made us children. I think we must note, we must be aware before we can begin to fathom or begin to examine God's love of how immense it is. God's love is incredible. In fact, we read, we say that God's love is like the ocean. And I kind of wondered whether that does it justice, because as immense, as incredibly large as the oceans are, Crystal, it takes forever to fly across them, doesn't it? There is a finite amount of liquid there, of water in those oceans. And so does that give God's love, justice? But then I realized something a week or so ago when we were at Niagara Falls. You see, Lake Erie's not near as big as those oceans are, is it? Big enough, Mike. It'll give you some boating room up there. But it was amazing to me to see the mouth of Niagara River, where the lake flows into the river. And we went down to those falls and we looked at that immense amount of water flowing out of that lake and over that falls. The American Falls alone, which is not near as large as the Horseshoe Bridge or Horseshoe Falls, and it has the Bridal Veil Falls right next to it, but the American Falls alone is just discharging 75,000 gallons of water per second. Per second. And it flows, and it flows, and it flows, and it flows, and it continues to flow. And yet Lake Erie does not fall in its water level. These things do justice to the love of God. It's immense. As John wrote, as Jesus said, for God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son. God's love, however, is not complacency. Many would describe it as such. But I think some of the context there in 1 John, the 2nd chapter, and into the 3rd chapter really gets at this idea. And I'm mindful of this fact as I appreciate and experience the love of God. God has not saved me so that I can remain the same that I am. God did not give his Son for me so that I can continue the sin as though nothing has changed. Paul, speaking of grace to the Romans in the 5th chapter, talks about how immense the grace of God is. And he says that when sin abounds, grace all the more abounds. And by the time we get to the 6th chapter, he asks a very logical question. He jumps ahead of Mike. He knows where Mike's going in his mind. And he says, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? If God's love is so great that it will save a sinning world, if God's grace is so great that it is great enough to overcome my sin regardless of what that is, then why would I not just continue as I am? Because God's love is not complacent. See, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. We talked last week of the value, of the importance of that law of righteousness that existed before the creation of mankind. And about how essential it is for mankind in the entire universe to be blessed. God's not complacent, says, don't worry about that law. Don't worry about righteousness. No, he made sure the law was fulfilled. And then he calls on you and I to do our best to live righteous lives. He made preparation for our failure. He made payment for our debt. But his love is not complacent to leave us in our sin. It is not a mere emotion or feeling. I searched and searched on Google to find what I was looking for, Tom, to no avail. And then I thought, I have it right here on my phone. We know the kind of love that man has. It's of emotion and feeling. Not that completely summarizes our love. And that's not to say that there is no emotion or there is no feeling in God's love. But it's been noted many times throughout man's history, it's probably been seen in your own life, that an individual will give up absolutely everything he has on a blind impulse and a momentary emotion, with absolutely no restraint, as these little guys show us. With absolutely no thought for the future, with absolutely no thought for cleaning up afterwards. And some would say God's love is just that way. That he saw you, he saw me, that he saw mankind in our great need, and he was willing to do anything to alleviate our problem. And there's an element of truth to that. But we must acknowledge that it was not a blind impulse. It was, as Paul in the book of Ephesians writes, it was planned before the foundations of the world. God prepared, God planned, and thereby we can be assured God will expect a standard out of us. It's likely implied in this verse that we're looking at. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever shall believe in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. You see, if God's love was merely an emotion, if it was merely an emotion, there would be no criteria whatsoever. It would be universal salvation. But he says, no, that law must be protected. It must be accounted for. Having spoke a little bit about what the love of God is not, the fact that it is not complacent, that it is not mere emotion or feeling, we come to the idea that God's love is fraternal. In John 3:16, we see that it's paternal. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that he has treated us like his very own children. In chapter 3, that he has made us his sons. It's a love of a parent to a child. But you see, he gave us Jesus Christ. And Jesus' love is fraternal. In Hebrews, the 2nd chapter and verse 11, we read, both the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers. Isn't that amazing? Jesus Christ, God himself, lowered himself to life on this earth, a humble life, an uncomfortable life. I don't know about you, Eddie. You were born some years before I, 1 or 2, right? But if I had to choose, I definitely would choose to be born in 1979, or even back as far as you were born, just a year or 2, like I said, prior to that. But I sure would not want to be born anywhere in the 80s or throughout the Middle Ages. I like air conditioning. I like heating. I like padding. I like vehicles. I could go on and on and on. But you see, Jesus came to earth as a lowly carpenter's son. And he lived his life in a very humble manner. And then he presented his life, his obedience, to the point of death, even death on the cross. Now, it's one thing to help individuals out. I've picked up a number of hitchhikers. And I've done what I can do to help them. But you know, Pam, I've never looked at one of them as though they were a brother. I give Chris and Stephanie, for that matter, a hard time. I pick on them every chance I get. I make sure that every time Chris and I are together, he'll introduce me as his brother. I'll say, I know it's hard for you to believe because I'm too good looking to be his brother. Right? I poke them every chance I get. But the fact of the matter is, I see them as equals. Isn't it amazing that Jesus came to be your brother? That Jesus sees you as brothers and sisters. Many other verses, 2 Timothy 2, we could read, and many other passages that he continues as a mediator. That means that he sits with the Father and he says, Dad, you know, Stephanie really needs. Stephanie could really use your help. And he does so as the one that can bridge that gap between mankind and God, being equal to both God and mankind. Seeing you is his brother. His love was fraternal. Fourthly, however, God's love was disinterested. Now we understand it was not disinterested in you, because for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. That if it was disinterested in you, if it was disinterested in me, we have that kind of love all the time. In fact, we'd say it was non-existent, wouldn't we, Tom? Whatever. You know. Or maybe as James says, be full, brother. Now, I hope Amanda says something like that to me in just a little bit. Might be full. But she's going to drive me somewhere to eat first. Right? She's going to be willing to pay the check for me afterwards, John. I'm hoping. You see, God's love is not disinterested in you and not me, but rather it's disinterested in his own well-being. Let me ask you, what did God gain from saving mankind? What did God gain by saving you? Oh, I serve him. I show up on Sundays and worship. I study my Bible. I pray. I praise him. What's the song, Kevin? I'll put you on the spot because it just jumped in my head, so I have no idea. Though the whole world were mine to give, it would not be enough.
You want me on that?
Stumped you.
Not sure.
If anyone else knows, you can. There's some puzzled looks. I'll have to Google it afterwards, Fred. But no matter what we could give to God, right? Jeremiah says, my righteousness is but dirty rags. I can't give anything to God that he hasn't first given to me. And even in my return and giving it to him, I give it to him marred and imperfect. God did not save us for his own good. He saved us for your good, for my good. He was, in the truest sense, non-profit. I mentioned this morning in our Bible study, but I believe understanding this characteristic of God's love will help us in our evangelism. That when I reach out to share the gospel with individuals, that I must do it not of interest of myself. When I speak to my children about God's love and the necessity to dedicate their lives to God's love, they must see, they know I'm invested in them. They know I care about them. But they must see that I do it for their good, not just mine. God's love was disinterested. On the seeming opposite side of the scale, fifthly, we see that God's love was zealous. Two opposite ideas. You see, it was disinterested in himself. It is zealous for you. I remember I wasn't driving yet. I decided I wanted to go to Helsinki's rodeo school. I didn't have enough money and I didn't have a ride to go. And it tells me I shouldn't tell these stories. It discredits me. I was determined. Dad said no. He said no, not once or twice, but probably 18 times. See, that's the wonderful thing, and there's a lesson here about saving souls. It doesn't matter how many no's we get, all it takes is one yes. And I wanted to go. Oh, I worked at it. I did everything, and eventually, seemingly at the last moment, I got in the Steinman's car, and off we went to Henderson, Tennessee. Well, foolish goal, right? Go down there and go, bust it up, Tom. Something worth working for? I was zealous. It's interesting, when we look at God's love, we see its zealousness. Many of you here are zealous for hunting. Doesn't matter how cold it is, first day of hunting season. I know where you're going to be. Some of you are zealous for fishing. Some of you, ladies, are zealous for shoes. We dedicate ourselves to things. I don't know most of your particular inclinations, where it is that you get fired up about. But I think you can relate. There's some things in your life that you don't allow everything else to get in the road of. You're going to get it done. It's amazing to me to think that God's love for me is that way. Different picture of God, I believe, than oftentimes we see painted of them. The Hebrew writer says that Jesus is the perfect replication, the perfect image of God. I believe what Hebrew writer in chapter 1 is getting at, if God was human, he'd be Jesus. Jesus is God in human form. We look at the life of Jesus, we see zealous love. In fact, the first time that he goes into the temple, he cleanses the temple. He sits down first and he makes a whip of cords. And then he cleanses the temple. And the disciples think of this psalm, 69 and verse 9. The verses prior and after it are very relevant too. But they're mindful that it was written, the zeal of thine house has eaten me up, has consumed me. What they're looking at, they're saying, Fred, that you've got so excited about this, you're getting yourself in a position it's going to kill you. They were right about that, but they were saying more than they realized as well. God's love is zealous. God's love is sacrificial. How many of you in here really like potato chips? Handful? Okay. I'm not a huge potato chip fan. But the best thing I could find a picture of to illustrate it. True love? Tom, let's let Tina have that last potato chip. You know what I'm talking about. You look, there's only one left. My household, we have a teenage boy. So there's only one left. The 5 or 6 prior to that are shoved in the back of his mouth. And that last one is in his hands, along with the other 15 that preceded that. Make sure he got it. He hasn't got a hold of his sacrificial love when it comes to potato chips or food yet. Maybe once he quits growing, there'll be hope for that. God's love is sacrificial. I think about what I give God. Admittedly, I try my very best to avoid that which is sacrificial. I contribute on Sundays, but I'm not sure it's to the point of sacrificial. I'm certain it's not to the point of sacrificial. I look at my life and I don't see anything lacking. Oh, would I like my bank account to be larger? Would I like my retirement to look a little better? Would I like... But I'm not wanting for anything. David looked and he said, I will not give to God what cost me nothing. King is giving them these things. Says, here, sacrifice this to your God. They said, I can't sacrifice it. It costs me nothing. What about my time? If I get around to that, if I have time, one of the things that I've enjoyed about cutting down to 2 days a week of secular work is I can have scheduled times to study, scheduled days. Normally Wednesdays are devoted almost entirely to studying. I love that. What about when it's sacrificial? When something that hurts, when something else cannot be done. When I look at the love of God, it was sacrificial. Giving His only Son to be baptized in suffering and shame of the cross was sacrificial. Jesus giving up the glory of heaven for the joy of the cross was sacrificial. God's love is particular and thereby universal. It's universal and thereby particular. He says, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him shall not perish but have everlasting life. You know what that means? There is hope for Michael Smith. I'm covered in the whosoever. That's good because I don't make the top of a lot of other lists. Russ, I know you were a basketball player. I played basketball up until I rodeoed throughout elementary and through 9th grade. There could have been about 12 or 14 of us on that team. I didn't make the top 5. Connie came to watch me sit on the bench a good many times. I finally got into a game, late in the game. We're blowing them out, Andy, and Gary's refereeing. I drive to the hoop, and a kid almost knocks me out. Maybe there's a little bit of exaggeration there, but not much. Well, I'm waiting for the whistle. It doesn't come. I turn and I say, ref, where's the foul? Gary says, hey, where's the blood? He ruined my single chance to make the NBA. Took those foul shots away from me. Right there in the spot. My point is, I didn't make the top of the list. There's not many lists I do make the top of the list. But I make God's list. Because His love is universal. And thereby it's particular. Because He loves all, He loves you. And because He loves you and you and you and you and you, He loves all. It's an amazing love because you know, and I know you know, because I know some people are easier to love than others. God's love is patient. I want a shirt like this. Not for me, but for unsent children. God's love is patient. God's love is perfectly patient. Peter said he's not slack, he's not slow concerning his promises, but is long-suffering usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. I remember sitting down with Uncle Dan many times, and we'd sit in what was his kitchen table at that time, and numerous times he said to me, Mike, I don't know why he didn't come back yesterday. I look at my life and I've wondered so many times, I don't know why he didn't give up on me yesterday. He's patient. He's waiting for you. He's waiting for me. What parent? We understand love as a parent, right? I thought I found love when I found Amanda Raven. I didn't know love till I had children. That's the truth of it. And there's not one of those 3 children sitting there today that I can say that I've not acted impatiently with. When I think of the patience of God's love, it's amazing. He doesn't fret. Which of my children, which of your children can you say you haven't fretted over? You haven't become frustrated with? You haven't lost your temper? And yet God is there. I think of the prodigal son. We see in the prodigal son, he doesn't act in mere emotion. He doesn't act from sheer feeling. But I know it was hard for the father. I know that because I read what he did when he saw his son returning, what he said when he had his son's ear. It's one of the most beautiful songs I've ever heard, The Day God Ran. And the telling of the prodigal son is the only time in Scripture that we have told that God ran. But you see, he was patient. He's patient. I've been in many business deals where I've said, you have until this time, and the offer no longer stands. Walt Disney said that every man needs a deadline. We have deadlines, but they're not set by the limit of patience of God. Lastly, this morning, God's love is a jealous love. Jealousy has such a negative connotation to it, doesn't it? Jealousy is said to mean merely, Amanda, where have you been? Spending too much time. I don't know what she spends too much time doing. Normally has something to do with the house, children, or church. Where were you? No, that's not the kind jealous God is. God is jealous of other affections, of other gods, of other supreme interests in your life. He's jealous in the sense, as we see here, he's willing to protect and guard. Matt, you think you could grab a hold of that little cub if that big mama wasn't there? Yeah, Mama's there, no problem, right?
I'll walk right up to it.
Grab her cup. Not gonna do it.
Great.
Flawless plan. Where could it go bad? Changes the whole equation.
Absolutely.
You aren't gonna touch that cup. Not gonna get near. God's concerned for you. God's jealous. But God doesn't want a divided interest either. Why should he? I inadvertently was talking about the year you were born, Eddie. Not sure what year that is. You want to share it?
35.
1935. It was a good year. Made good models that year. 1935. I was born in 79. Any of these can't imagine me in building 79. God paid the price, Eddie, for you to make it to heaven over 1,900 years before you were ever born. In good faith that you would do it justice. I don't know about you, Fred, but I don't make that payment until that contract's signed. Right? I'm not going to give a used car salesman a check and expect him to provide the vehicle. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son over 2,000 years before you were ever born. If you've not submitted your life to God's love, there's no greater force you will ever encounter, no greater blessing that you could ever receive in this life. Why not convert your entire belief to Him? Confess Him to be Lord of your life. Turn from the things of this life, submitting yourself to Him. Starting that journey by being immersed for the remission of sins. If you're subject to the good news of that gospel call, then why not come forward as together we stand and sing?